The other thing that was just fascinating to come out of your research was the sort of fieldcraft and the paranoia and the way that Putin and his inner circle go about their business. Um, and I'm certain that our listeners, viewers would be fascinated to hear some of what you unearthed. Joe, tell us about the identical conference rooms with the exact same number of sharpened pencils and what that tells us about the way Putin does his business.
We were not expecting when we, started as, to be frank, non kind of Kremlin specialists, just investigative correspondents who were thrown into this story, to find so many Cold War tropes and so many kind of stories that you think would just come straight out of a spy novel. But Putin has been a KGB agent since he was a young man. He still views the world very much through an intelligence lens and a lens of paranoia. And we all saw aspects of that, particularly during COVID with the long table and the isolation and people questioning at that point before the invasion, actually, just how, whether he was still completely kind of, compos mentis. But what we realized in our research is that paranoia goes much, much deeper. So Putin is so concerned about his own personal security and so mistrustful even of his top officials that he wants to keep it ambiguous a lot of the time exactly where he is. We know he has an office in the Kremlin. He doesn't allegedly spend as much time in the Kremlin as he once did and prefers to be in his palaces elsewhere across Russia. But at least according to the American intelligence agency and others that we spoke to, he's built these identical rooms so that when he's photographed, he could, in theory, be in any one of these palaces. And he even goes to the lengths of, at certain points, flying decoy planes from one airport to another so that his own officials would be convinced he's in one place when he's actually in another. It says a lot, I think, about the mentality of the man, that everything is so perfectly kind of confected and configured in this way that nobody actually really knows what he's thinking, what he's doing.
And did that level of fieldcraft, did that predate the renewed invasion of Ukraine, or do you think that's a consequence of Ukrainian long range capabilities that have emerged since?
There's no doubt that Ukraine has increased his paranoia about his personal protection, but the story of Putin is one story. It's a long. This didn't begin on February of 2022. His descent into increased isolation. There's many points on that road. One of them is the pandemic, by the way. He spent a lot of time during the pandemic holed up reading historical texts about the ancient status of Ukraine, things that obviously affected his kind of warped historical understanding of where we are today.
We were amazed to find out just how granularly he's briefed about operations as well. I think a big question that everyone's had over the years with Litvinenko, with Skripal, how high does it go? Does it actually reach Putin's desk, or are these just, entrepreneurial senior FSB officials or GRU officials that have been given some kind of vague nod and have decided to take the initiative? With the research that we've done, at least, particularly on the illegals, the spies that Putin ultimately wanted to swap in this massive swap that included Evan and many others, he knew absolutely about all of these operations, down to the details of when they were having children, down to the details of when they were moving and being relocated. Very, very personal details. And I think that goes to his lifelong, frankly, interest in and kind of mythologization of the deep cover Soviet and now Russian illegals as being the kind of Praetorian Guard, the ultimate spies among spies.
Because one person can only do so much. And to be in that level of detail around defense and security and intelligence operations must surely mean there are other areas of the governance of Russia in which he is less engaged. Or is the man just a complete workaholic, holed up in his identical bunkers, sort of working 22 hours a day?
Well, the question for us, and the book sort of raises it, is how much of what Putin is told is true? The
Yeah.
invasion, I mean, to give you a really good example, it was the FSB, the spy agency, that organized the invasion of Ukraine. The defense ministry, which usually when you're about to invade another country, your defense ministry is pretty busy. They were working normal 9 to 5 days before, in the weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. It was the FSB that had been given the mission, the assignment of warming up Ukraine's public opinion, identifying potential collaborators, basically creating a fifth column that would take over. It was the FSB that had, told Putin that this will go well. We'll be welcomed as liberators. We'll heal, this artificial division between Russia and Ukraine. And it went really badly, obviously. And we're now, the whole world on some levels, but especially Ukraine and Russia, are now in 3 years into this kind of awful war, and you're coming up on 4 years of this awful war. Part of which is premised on just a bogus interpretation of who Ukrainian people are.
And it raises quite an interesting question. If you think about, we like to sort of satirize the mercurial nature of Western politicians who can sort of sit watching Fox and Friends with their phone in their hand and sort of make policy on the go live on True Social. And that clearly is no way to govern a country. But it is similarly terrifying that Putin, because of his paranoia over his security, doesn't have a mobile phone, only uses computers that are air-gapped, hardly ever accesses the internet, and so he's entirely dependent on others to give him their editorialized version of what is going on. He has no direct access to information beyond, which is every bit as bad as being over-informed and sort of making policy on the hoof as a consequence.
Yeah, it obviously hands an extraordinary amount of power to his chief lieutenants, and there's a kind of a huge competition in the layer directly underneath Putin to be the ones who are in charge of editing the information that ultimately gets to the boss. And as the book shows, he still likes to receive his information in a very kind of old-fashioned briefing paper type way. And he is also, as far as we understand, he is a workaholic. He does work extraordinary hours, but it's this particular predilection for wanting to know about the intelligence operations. And I think you're right, at the expense perhaps of other policy that he must cede to other people. It's very, very particular about him. And for sure, what we learned during the reporting of this was when it came to the policy of arresting Americans, and then when it came to the trading, Putin was the chief decider and was very, very well briefed.